Cawley, and it seems like I've been doing this show for a while, Dave, but it hasn't been that long. We started in June.
Yeah.
And I met you in terms of this show about that time. You came on and introduced us to a podcast that you had done, that you were working on. And I'll have to say, I got hooked. I got completely hooked on your Uinta Triangle podcast. I'd never listened to, and I'm embarrassed to say this because there are a lot of good ones out there. My kids will tell me that, the 2 or 3 or 4 part series podcast. You came in and said, you were talking to us about issues 1 and 2 come out, or the first
segment. Couple episodes.
So I thought, well, I need to listen to him because he's coming back next week, and I want to act like I'm smart. Well, then I was like, when's the next one coming out? I gotta listen. I gotta listen to this, and so again, now I'm thinking, could I ever do something like that? Could I ever produce something like that? And I can't even imagine the time you put into that, because you actually tell our listeners the backdrop of the story a little bit, and then I want to have you describe the commitments you had to make personally to make that work.
Yeah, I appreciate you setting that up. And I'll just say at the outset, Greg, I've worked in news and media for a lot of years, and hey, I need to check this person's work before I interview him, that's pretty rare. So thank you. The Uinta Triangle podcast, for me, it's a story that bubbled up out of the newsroom, my career covering news, and it was about this man from Australia who came to hike a trail in Utah in 2011, and he was solo hiking, and he didn't make it to the end. There was a big search and rescue effort and no discovery of his remains. And over the course of many years covering the story and the aftermath of it, I got to know this man, Eric Robinson's wife, Marilyn Coolstra, who lives in Australia, and talked to her kind of in a, I guess I would call it, a typical reporter way. There's some distance. She doesn't know me very well. I don't know her very well. I'm asking her questions about, this traumatic experience she's been involved in. And over the course of time, got closer, learned a lot more about her life, her husband's life, and some of the events that took place. I don't want to, spoil everything in the podcast if you haven't listened to it. But it just struck me as, this is a really deeply human story that I want to tell. And it took the shape of, a multi-episode. So I think I'm trying to remember 9 episodes in this series, Uinta Triangle, where we really follow the search for Eric Robinson and then ultimately bring it to the modern day and see where Marilyn's at now.
Yeah, and that was really interesting that you mentioned Marilyn, because that came across so well. And as I was listening to the podcast, the first time you talked to her, I could tell that this woman is like, wait a minute, what level of confidence do I have with this man, or why should I participate? And by the end, and I don't want to spoil anything, you two were friends, you two were colleagues, you two were on the same page, and it was that relationship, although it was tangential to the story, was very interesting to see how she, her personality changed during the course of the podcast and her involvement. And then there were all these other people. It was like you're on this trail and you keep meeting a different person, and then they come and they go, and it was you wove them in really well.
Well, thank you, Greg. One of the things that really was going through my mind during all of the reporting work, which was years of reporting on this story, was kind of the why do we do it? Why do we tell this story? This, out of all the stories in the world, why choose to invest on this one? And I'm thinking back to earlier when we were talking about, Governor Cox and his statements on 60 Minutes and looking for the people who are building up rather than tearing down. And to me, here's this gentleman from Australia. He doesn't really have many connections here in Utah, and he goes missing in what's essentially my backyard. And I felt like an obligation as a local reporter to put in the extra effort and the time to try to really dig into the story, just out of respect for him. He's a fellow human being. It doesn't matter that he's not a Utahn, he's not an American. He's another human being, and he deserves that. And, so I hope that came through in the story that was put together. It is a story about the loss of this man's life ultimately, but it's also about the love that he and his wife shared and the kind of camaraderie I think that we all share in our love for natural places.
And were you at all concerned that you became part of the story as opposed to telling the story? Because you did. You had to go in. You had to do some research yourself. You had to walk some steps.
Absolutely
you know what I mean?
right. Yeah.
And so I was interested in that because it's one thing to be a reporter, which you've done for your career, but it's another thing to be part of the story.
It
and
is.
you were.
It is, yeah, and believe me, I'm conscious of that. I'm looking through the glass behind you at Maria Chaleos, our good friend from KSL NewsRadio, who's now looking up at me. Maria is also, she teaches journalism at the University of Utah. In a lot of ways, doing the Uinta Triangle story violated some of the very, prime things you're taught in journalism school, not to use the word I, not to inject yourself in the center of the story. And some rules are made to be broken. There are some stories that demand, I think, a more personal approach. If I'm going to sit down and tell you a 9-hour narrative story and pretend like I don't have investment, I'm being disingenuous.
Yeah. So Uinta Triangle, tell our listeners because I think of the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
And there was the similarity was not lost on me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that title is meant to be, evocative. You're thinking about the mystery of it because it is a story about a man who disappeared in these mountains, and we draw in stories about other people who have disappeared in the Uinta Mountains. I've had people ask me, what are the corners of this triangle? And it's like, I could draw many ones that would fit different. It's more about this idea that for whatever reason, this mountain range in Utah here seems to draw people in, and for some reason, some of those folks don't come out. And we're focusing very specifically in this season on one, but there are other cases. I'll tell you, we've got a case right now in Duchesne County. A young man came over from Europe in March of this year and caught a ride share from the Salt Lake City International Airport to Moon Lake on the south slope of the Uinta Mountains, and he hasn't been seen since.
My word.
So I've talked to, folks at the Duchesne County Sheriff's Office who are in charge of that investigation, and, they're just as flummoxed as anybody else as to what, was going on. So it is something that happens. It keeps happening. We've had close calls. Just this last summer, we had a young lady who spent an overnight as a missing person up in the Uinta Mountains. And I think there are things that we can take away as, folks who recreate in the backcountry. I've talked to you about maybe, you want to get out and try a little solo hike. And I applaud you for that. I think you should, but also, we need to be safe in doing those kinds of things.
I have to.
You should.
After listening to it, I have to go. This is personal, but I have to go into the Uintas. I have to go because I've hiked the Uintas, and we had scout camp up there.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were describing some of the places, some of the areas, of course, I haven't been nearly as deeply involved but I can picture that. I know that Mirror Lake Highway. I know the lakes up there, and I know that the road back down over to Evanston on the other side. And I'm very familiar, having cycled through that area on the road, and hiked that area a little bit, but I have to do a solo trek up there, and I'll talk to you first.
Yeah.
And
I'm happy to give pointers.
I'll carry my beacon or whatever it is, but I do want to go up there.
And I mean, we talked earlier to the folks at the Utah Office of Tourism and Film about the potential shutdown that's looming and what that would mean for national parks. And look, for me, part of the reason I choose to live in Utah is because we have proximity to wilderness, national forest, Bureau of Land Management, national park. Like, we have this wealth, and you don't develop informed opinions about the management of these places unless you get to spend time in them. So yeah, I'm all for giving you some pointers if you want, trail recommendations or anything like that.
And what also struck me, we only got a minute left, was the expanse. I mean, this is a huge area, which you don't think of. You think, well, it's in northeast corner of Utah is sort of some summit and some, Uinta, Duchesne County area. It's a pretty small area, but it's an expanse. I mean, it's an expanse. And looking for a person up there makes it even more expansive.
To stand on one of those passes and look out over the landscape and just think, how would I find a single human being here? It definitely sells the challenge of that story.
Uinta Triangle, you have to listen to it.